I'd like to open today's talk by reading you a brief excerpt from what I think of as a truly remarkable document. It's a letter. It was written in 1884 by a young immigrant named Kathy. It's addressed to her mother back in Ireland, in Ballylarkin, Ireland. And at the time this letter was written, Kathy was living on her own in New York. Unlike many other immigrant groups, the Irish did not come over to the US as families. They came over one by one, many as teenagers, found work, and supported themselves, then sending whatever money they could afford back home to the families who were living precariously in the wake of the Great Potato Famine. This was, if you read 97 Orchard, or if you come to the museum, the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, you'll learn that this was exactly the case for another young Irish girl named Bridget Meehan, who traveled to New York in 1863 at age 17. And again, she traveled on her own, somehow managing to gird her nerves through the 12-day or 2-week, it was around 2-week journey from Ireland to New York, then establish herself as this teenage girl somehow when she got to these shores. By age 19, Bridget was married to a fellow immigrant. His name was Joseph Moore. And by age 24, the couple had moved into 97 Orchard with their 3 young girls. Upon arriving in the US, girls like Bridget and like Kathy generally found work as live-in servants, one of the few jobs that were open to young Irish women, but also a very good way to save money on room and board. Kathy's letter, which you're about to hear, describes in quite dramatic style some of the challenges that life entailed. And here's how the letter begins. My dear Mama, what on earth is the matter with you all that none of you would think of writing to me? The fact is, I'm heartsick fretting. I cannot sleep the night, and if I chance to sleep, I wake up with the most frightful dreams. To think it's now going and gone into the 3rd month since you wrote to me, I feel as if I'm dead to the world. And this is just how the letter begins. It continues in very similar, this plaintive vein, until the final line. And that line is, I trust you are well and that my frightful dreams won't be realized. And then running up the side of the letter in Kathy's kind of spidery handwriting, you see the following postscript. With love to one and all, and for God's sake, write soon, your lonely daughter, Kathy. Well, there's no explicit reference here to food, but Kathy's letter describes very vividly the emotional context in which immigrant food was consumed. Along with the challenges of just material survival, of the roof over the head and getting food for the table, immigrants faced a tremendous battery of psychological pressures. Maybe the worst of them, as you can tell from this letter, as you can feel in this letter, was loneliness. But there was also shame and isolation and anxiety. For immigrants, these were all a regular part of day-to-day life. Add to this the cultural strangeness of a city like New York, the hard geometry of the urban grid, the almost total absence of anything green, the noise, the crowds, the density, the tempo of the city. These were all beyond anything the immigrant had ever experienced or could even imagine. In this alien environment, food was a precious source of continuity, and immigrants went to extraordinary lengths to recreate the way of eating, the only way of eating that they had ever known. And I'm going to tell you a bit about how they managed to do that. But before I do, I'd like you to know something about the world of the tenements. This is the physical environment in which all of this interesting food was being cooked and consumed. The first tenements in New York were makeshift structures. In other words, they were one-family homes, and they were respectable one-family homes in now declining neighborhoods that were chopped up in a kind of indiscriminate way into apartments for the poor, for poor working people. Around 1830, the first multiple family dwelling, this was now purposely built, appeared in New York. These were brick buildings. They were 4 or 5 stories tall, and they were intended for the city's growing population of factory workers. As the East Side population to continue to soar, immigrants adapted the tenement to their own needs. So, for example, living spaces designed for a small family were taken over by a mother, a father, 5 or 6 brothers, a cousin just arrived, and maybe even a couple of boarders. Living in such close quarters, tenement dwellers exploited to the fullest whatever space they did have available to them. So, for example, with kitchens full of children and stoves and tables and chairs, homemakers would pull a chair into the doorway, she would sit in the hall, and this is where she might pluck her chickens, or peel her potatoes, or scale her fish. The hallway is also where men took their pipes, later their cigars, and used as a smoking parlor. In bad weather, children turned the stairwells into indoor playgrounds, using the banisters as their jungle gyms. Domestic life in the tenements was not confined to the apartments. Rather, it flowed through the building into the stairwells, onto the roof, onto the streets, blurring the line that we are more respectful of and adhere to more fully. It's the line between public and private, between our private lives in the home and the public world of the streets. And exactly the same blurring of lines was true of food. There was no such thing in the tenements as a private family dinner. Cooking smells traveled through the building so that everyone knew what everyone else was eating. They knew as well if a neighbor's kitchen was quiet, and this was a sign that the family was in trouble. So you'll see many instances in immigrant literature of immigrant homemakers around dinner time making noise with the pots and pans to give the impression that food was being cooked so that neighbors would not know how bad the trouble was. But if you did know, if you noticed that there was quiet coming from a kitchen, you were sure later that evening to creep in and ask if you could do something, if you could help. Food also moved through the building, so not only the smells and the aromas and the sounds, but the food itself. So if you were old, or if you were sick, or if somebody were sick in the family, a child from one of the neighbors downstairs would come up with an extra pot of kugel, or a cholent, or the leftovers of the boiled chicken in a kind of informal support system. And when the pot was clean, the same kid would go back up and retrieve it and bring it home to the mother. The idea being here that in your own hard times, and in the tenements, no one was immune from hard times, you would expect the same consideration. Tenement living also blurred the lines between home and work. The Lower East Side, as many of you know, was famous for its sweatshops. These were tenement apartments converted into small-scale garment factories. Less well known, these same apartments served as food factories in their home kitchens. For example, Italians produced candy and ice cream and pasta. Jews made pickles and knishes and arbas. These are the roasted chickpeas that older Jewish women would sell on the street as street food. To my astonishment, tenements also functioned as urban poultry farms. Every immigrant group arrived in the US with certain well-defined food affections and food affinities, traditions that were absolutely unshakable and which they just wouldn't forsake. For Eastern European Jews, that included kosher meat, and more particularly, kosher poultry. On Friday nights, the Jewish Sabbath, poultry appeared on the table in the form of soup, while the next day, the boiled chicken meat was eaten cold. But more valuable than either the soup or the meat was the fat, the schmaltz. Through the 19th and early 20th centuries, Jewish cooks relied on schmaltz for frying, for braising, for baking. They used it as a seasoning for the chopped liver. They used it to moisten their kugels. They used it in their rugula. They used it in their baked goods. No kosher poultry meant no kosher schmaltz. This was unthinkable. So immigrants lived with the birds despite the smell and the noise and whatever objectionable side effects these birds produced to have this food that life was not right if you didn't have, without schmaltz, there was no way to go on. This was how it was done. Americans from the period were generally curious and often puzzled by immigrant eating habits. When it came to the Italians, Americans were mystified by the immigrants' excessive fondness for vegetables, most notably for salad greens. At a time when a wholesome American meal consisted of meat and potatoes and maybe some boiled peas or maybe some boiled carrots, the Italians were wasting their time with uncooked plants. This is like it was shrubbery to the American point of view, with their escaroles and their lettuces and their arugulas. The immigrant salads were typically dressed with lemon and olive oil, another food which American observers were baffled by. Every dish in the Italian kitchen was slippery with this olive oil, from the lettuce to the fish to the pasta. It was an indulgence which Americans found questionable. Native-born charity workers on the Lower East Side, they tried convincing Italian women to give up their imported olive oil, which they saw as an unnecessary luxury food, and replace it with good American lard. But the Italians stood firm. Olive oil was another of these indispensable foods, and it was worth the extra pennies. No one could tear them away from their olive oil. Though immigrants used the tenements to raise their own food, the backbone of the immigrant food economy was the pushcart market, a retail system unique to neighborhoods like the Lower East Side that turned city streets into one continuous open-air bazaar. For immigrant homemakers, the pushcarts were America's antidote to hunger. Pushcarts provided her with a wide assortment of familiar foods and at the lowest possible prices. Think back to your grandmother's kitchens. You could find those heavy rye breads. They were baked as 5-pound loaves and cut into sections. You could find herring in every denomination. You could find the pikes and the carps that were so important to the Sabbath table. You could find all of the wonderful root vegetables that were used for the winter borschts, and in the summer, you could find the stav that our grandmothers used to make the delicious cold soups. I don't know if any of you are stav eaters. It's one of my absolute favorite foods. Also, importantly, the push carts allowed tenement homemakers to buy foods in the often minuscule quantities they desired, whether that was a half a parsnip or one egg or a handful of parsley or a half a cup of barley, not 1 ounce more than the homemaker needed. These limited storage inside the tenement kitchen necessitated these kinds of miniature purchases. There was simply nowhere to put food in the kitchen. So homemakers were continuously shuttling between their kitchens and the markets, using the markets almost as an extension of their pantries. On the other hand, these minuscule purchases were the only kinds that tenement homemakers could afford. So it really worked for them on all levels. The women on Orchard Street, who lived directly above one of the busiest markets on the Lower East Side, sometimes didn't even go down to the market, but would stick their upper bodies out of the window, leaning on the sills. They would gesture to one of the peddlers downstairs. They would shout down what they wanted, and then they would send one of the kids down with a nickel or a couple of pennies, watch as the kid was given the right merchandise, and the kid would come back up with the food and the change. So again, you see that very interesting blurring of inside and outside, of public and private. Native-born New Yorkers who ventured into the pushcart markets were horrified by what they considered unsanitary conditions and by what they saw as shoddy merchandise. According to reports in the city newspapers, the fruits were underripe, the cheeses were wormy, the bread was moldy, and so on. But one food of special concern was pickles. New Yorkers denounced the open pickle barrels that were lined up along curbs as receptacles for disease. The pickle vendor, moreover, was inevitably this burly, sort of hefty, maybe not particularly well-scrubbed male immigrant who would plunge his entire arm into the pickle vat to fish out whatever contents was required. So this was a true sanitary nightmare. But the truth is that the pickle itself was problematic on its own terms. To the well-educated uptown New Yorker, the pickle symbolized everything that was wrong with immigrant cooking. Following the nutritional wisdom of the day, pickles were too salty, they were too garlicky, they were too peppery, and they were too sour. All in all, they were just too flavorful. And immigrants ate them with abandon, consuming them with meals, between meals, straight from the barrel, like an apple. Now, without question, the Jewish ghetto was the epicenter of what was pronounced the Jewish pickle problem. Unfortunately, other groups living within proximity to the ghettos discovered the Jewish pickle, developed a taste for it, and before too long, the problem was epidemic. So according to the medical experts, and this was a very well-researched problem, if you go back into the nutritional literature from the period, you'll see that it was children who were the real victims of the immigrant pickle problem. Health workers were appalled to learn that tenement school kids spent their lunch money on pickles instead of more nutritionally appropriate foods like a white roll or applesauce or a cup of milk. The taste of the standard Jewish pickle was so aggressive that Americans wondered how anyone, and particularly a child with their tender and their innocent, their virgin palates, could eat this food by choice. Instead, they saw pickle eating as a kind of compulsion. More than a food, the pickle was looked on as a kind of drug for tenement kids who were still too young for whiskey. And they meant this quite literally. In the nutritional textbooks, you'll see there's a chapter set aside for a food group or it's not it's a food of material, a group of materials known as stimulants. And in this chapter, you will find coffee and tea and beer and whiskey, opiates, cocaine, and pickles. Now, as it turns out, the experts were not entirely wrong. Pickles were not exactly a gateway drug, but tenement kids did have this really special affection for them. The reason was simple. For a single penny, pickles delivered a wallop of flavor. It was this wonderful counterpoint to the noodles and the bread and the potatoes and all of the other bland, starchy foods that made up the bulk of your daily diet at home. And if you knew how to eat a pickle, if you were well trained in pickle eating, that pickle could last you all day. There's a wonderful scene in the book Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which Francie, who is the young heroine and who is not Jewish, who's a young Irish girl, goes in the morning to the local Jewish pickle vendor, buys her pickle for a penny, and spends the remainder of the day nursing this pickle, nibbling on it, sucking on it, wrapping it in a napkin, taking it out again, and it virtually lasts until dinner time. It's the popsicle that never melted. Looking beyond the realm of food, I'd like to close with a few final thoughts on the tenements and how they figured in immigrant history. The Lower East Side, and neighborhoods like the Lower East Side, served as a kind of immigrant training ground. In the relative safety of the tenements, surrounded by their countrymen, immigrants learned how to manage in America. They learned a new language. They learned new forms of work. They learned how to function in a new kind of domestic environment. They also learned, however, how to look and how to act and how to carry themselves like Americans. It was here in the tenements that women folded up their kerchiefs and purchased their first proper American hat. Men shaved their beards. They developed a taste for cigars. On Sundays, immigrants took the elevated railroad to Coney Island, just like any other working-class New Yorker. And on the 4th of July, immigrants on the Lower East Side lit bonfires. They hung flags from the fire escapes. They danced in the street to celebrate the birth of their country, and they very much considered this their country. These same immigrants, however, stayed loyal to their native foods. In 1916, the Board of Health issued this very interesting little booklet of recipes. It was called How to Cook for the Family, and it was designed specifically for the Yiddish-speaking homemaker. It was published in a bilingual edition in both Yiddish and in English. And it was really designed to Americanize foreign-born cooks. Well, the project was an entire flop. One East Side woman, when she was asked by a reporter what she thought about the booklet, well, this is how she responded. She said, "I make like Großmutter Selig, and I make like my mother, gefilte fish and stuffed Hälsel," in other words, the stuffed poultry neck. What should I care for the Board of Health? This is just one small indication of immigrant attitudes toward the American effort to transform the immigrant kitchen. I'd like to suggest that in the past 100+ years, eating habits have really come full circle. The foreign foods that caused us such concern are now mainstays of the American dinner table. We're not afraid of pickles. We're not suspicious of garlic. We have embraced olive oil and all of the wonderful greens that we serve it on every night at our own dinner tables. The immigrants gave us their food, but they also gave us their taste buds. And if we're lucky, I would say the immigrants also left us with just some small measure of their ingenuity, their stamina, and their spunk. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.